Howdy of you delicious people. For those of you that liked movies like The Nun and also liked Darkness Falls, here is this movie called The Unholy. So, really, I thought that this movie was actually interesting enough. Like, I think this movie was actually a decent film. You could go out of your way to finally say that you've seen this film by going into any number of apps that normally I've used reliably for X amount of time. I have been going into an app called Letter C Movies. So just put in the letter C and then movies. Or there's another app I've been frequently using lately that has the logo Fox HD Movies. If you put in the word Fox HD Movies, that app will show up fairly soon. It has a play 180p kind of thing. Like it's titled that way, but recently all you have to do is just go into the words Fox HD Movies, and that'll pop up fairly easily, fairly quickly if you have Google Play. If you have some other kind of source to find these apps, then you may not find them. But it is what it is. Going into The Unholy, I actually thought that this movie was really good, considering that the fact of it is that there isn't enough like horror parts. There isn't enough like time where you see the entity going and like killing everybody. If anything, we have this entity much more trying to make a lot of people uncomfortable and doing quite a bit of jump scares here and there to make people uncomfortable. Like to me, this kind of much more reminds me of it kind of reminds me much more of The Ring as far as scare level goes, where we end up having reasonably people having dreams or people having screen things that they are trying to adjust, and then they end up seeing supposedly the Virgin Mary pop up and scare the crap out of them. There are actually some pretty decent jump scares with this. They don't feel cheap. It actually looks like the jump scares are like very odd and goofy, but they are what they are. Really, I thought this is actually for what it was to put on, like, I thought that this was just a decent enough film. It could have been worse. It could have been boring. They could have, researched this whole, thing to death to you about, like, they could have given you the clear, definition of a miracle and what all every single research. They could have booked you to death in this movie, and they didn't. So thank God for that. We end up having also a very odd beginning of this movie, where all of a sudden we are trying to understand what the heck is even going on, but they explain what the heck was going on in the very beginning of this, somewhere in the tail end of this movie, where they're like, oh yeah, like maybe we should have got into that, like, sometime earlier in the movie, but no, let's just F all that, and they'll just have to get this, like, bizarrish, like, thought in their head of, like, what was going on in the beginning of this movie? Like, I want to know what was going on in the beginning there. That made no freaking sense to me, because you end up seeing a woman that is going through something through the perspective of her eyes. So you have her being doused with some bizarrish mask to where you can't barely see anything through these, like, tiny little holes, and you're eventually seeing that they're doing some kind of Salem witch trial like moment in the very beginning of this. And so, like, it's kind of very disorienting, the very beginning of this movie, but then eventually you're like, okay, like, I think I understand where we're going with this. Because immediately once I saw the tree, I was like, oh, okay, I can understand what's kind of going on. So with this movie, I actually thought that I thought there was going to be a lot more going on, in all brutal honesty. Like, I thought like I thought the monster or the creature or the whatever was going to get a lot more people. I thought that reasonably this whole thing was to get a lot of people to all believe in this monster, and then eventually this monster, one by one, will eventually, as if they are bizarrely tied to some final destination thing where, hey man, like you went on the ride, so you're gonna have to die. Like you said I agree in the terms and conditions, and now now you have to realize that you forgot to read the fine print on that agreeing slip. Really, that's what I thought was going to happen within this movie consistently. I thought everybody was going to get it at the end, kind of thing, but it seems like they didn't. But, anyways, really, I thought it was also kind of bizarre who was the person or people that did die in this film. Because, like, why go after that person and then I, I'm trying to get into I'm trying to say as cryptic as possible, but if people will understand going through this movie what I'm talking about, they'll understand. But for those of you that don't know, so I'm going to tee up this movie for people who don't know what this movie is at all. So we end up having Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who a lot of people know as Negan, and he's on Supernatural, really kind of tailoring into the fact of like this guy being in a lot of supernatural things. Now he's in this. So we have Jeffrey, who's playing a guy named Gary or Jerry. It's a Gerry. So I'm gonna say Gary. So we have Gary, who is seemingly going further and further down the most garbageest newspaper job that he can find, or just reporting job that he can find, to where we end up having Jerry, who is desperately just, or yeah, we'll go with Jerry. We'll go. If I'm wrong, then F it. So Jerry is to go on and trying to look for any job that could just make him a buck. It seems that every time that he ends up bringing a article uh, to his newspaper people, they end up offering him less and less every single time. To where we end up having Jerry, who's mentioning like, well, hey, I could have gotten this exact same amount of money for this exact same article as in another job. So we end up having it to where Jerry is just desperate to get some kind of news report, to the fact of him almost fabricating news reports so that way he can just make a buck. And we end up eventually having Jerry, who ends up stumbling onto this tree that has this doll next to it. And we end up having Jerry again fabricating this story again. The problem with that is we end up realizing that this fabrication ends up becoming a real, true, legitimate story. And then Jerry has to chase after this story because he's the only one there. We end up having Jerry, who ends up going and riding this horse of a story, and basically clinging on to this one girl and having it be that uh, like he exclusively is covering her and all kinds of things, to where we eventually end up finding out that this girl is starting to just heal people. But it seems like those heals come at a cost. And eventually we will come to those terms of those healing factors. And we will also come to the terms of finding out why this girl is doing these things. Why is this girl going to be showcasing us that she is some prominent like girl that is helping everyone, but if anything, she probably also doesn't realize that eventually she is also being persuaded by by this entity that she is getting whispered sweet nothings to consistently. we end up having this girl Alice who is starting to really try to push the fact that this entity Mary needs followers. She needs Facebook friends. She needs Instagrammers. She needs YouTube subscribers. So Mary is trying desperately to get a following because she desperately is. She may not be a social media fan, but she just needs to crunch some numbers to have her fellowship follow her undeniably, which eventually piddles out. So with that said, yeah, like that's kind of like the most tailbacky like version of this movie that I can go into. And so now I think it's about that time to go into the actual spoiler version of this movie. So let's go into the coveted double five time territory. To go into spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this episode or this movie. Yeah, it's a movie, right? Yeah, The Unholy. So going into this, so we end up having Jeffrey D. Morgan, who is going to uh, find out about some news article that he can do about a guy's cow that is getting mutilated. And so we have Jeffrey Dean Morgan who ends up going to this guy's place to check out his cow, and we end up having Jeffrey who ends up realizing that there is just some Metallica symbol on this cow, to where Jeffrey's like, God, like I can't get a photo of this cow. Like this is just a waste of time. And so we end up having Jeffrey who ends up going and hearing some talking, some sounds of some tree. And so we end up having Jeffrey who is to go to the sounds of this tree and then realize there is some doll there. We end up having Jerry who ends up breaking the head of this doll, and we end up having the farmer who is to come over with Jeffrey. And so we end up having Jeffrey Dean Morgan who is basically telling this farmer to say that there was some mysterious doll that had mutilated a cow. Like Jerry is trying to combine these two things that he had seen and this cow thing, so that way he can kind of justify this story. But he's just making false accusations to just try and get a news article out there to get some kind of money for this. So, in the very beginning of this movie, let's talk about this location that they were in. So, in the very beginning of this movie, we end up seeing from the perspective of some woman who is seemingly getting tied to, I would assess, this tree, and eventually getting a mask nailed upon her head. And we end up having some priest who is doing some ritual to, I guess, take the essence of this woman that is strapped to this tree, to have her essence or her spirit being possessed into this doll. Not in a very Child's Play Chucky like situation. No, I guess we really just want this priest to not have this entity escape or get out or whatever, this person to go to hell or whichever, or heaven, so that way, like, possess the spirit into this doll, that as long as they keep this doll without being broken, which that's what ends up happening, then the doll should be fine. So we go on and we end up having Jerry, who ends up staying in town for a little bit. And so we end up having, bizarrely, Jerry is now driven to go back to that tree. Like, for some reason, he is having horrible dreams and all kinds of things. which is just driving him to go back to this tree. Which, perfectly aligned, we have Jerry who is going back to this tree, and we end up having this girl who is spouting these words to this tree, and we end up finding out that this is some girl named Alice. So we end up finding out that this girl named Alice was not a person that had ever spoken before or had ever been a person that heard anything before. And bizarrely now we have Alice who is now cured of both of these things. And so we immediately have seemingly Jeffrey trying to track down this girl, or Jerry trying to track down this girl and go to church with her. And we end up having eventually. We end up having Father Hannigan, who is doing his proceedings, his psalms, and his whatever. But we end up having Alice, who ends up going out of the church, and so bizarrely, and everyone ends up following her to see what is going on, and so we end up having Jerry, who is recording all this. So we have it to where Alice is to go and talk to everyone, and they are just blown away by this because they know good and well that this girl could have never talked or spoken before. And so we have Father Hagen, who is actually her uncle. And so we end up having eventually that that Alice is to tell everybody that they are to come to this tree the very next day. And we end up having it to where Father Hannigan is kind of really stressed about all this. He doesn't even want Alice to go and do the thing that she had said that she was going to do. We have Father Hagen, who ends up calling this whole thing off because he's just kind of scared because he doesn't know what she'll do or what will happen. So we eventually go on, and so we have it to where it seems like a lot of people are just starting to go like, oh, this Alice girl, like she didn't speak and she couldn't hear before, but now she can do both. Like at some point we end up having Alice who is even ending up like singing at some point as well. And so we end up having seemingly two priests, Bishop Giles and Delgard, who end up coming to this church because it's like, okay, well, this tree could quite possibly had performed a miracle, but then maybe also it is just a hoax. We could have it to where Alice just was able to bizarrely just pick up talking to people, and she picked it up well. That could be a whole thing. It could be a hoax. It could be a mistake. It could be whatever. Before we end up having both the bishop and priest come in, we end up having Alice, who ends up deciding to go back to the tree, and a lot of people end up following her. And so we end up having Alice, who is telling a kid that is in a wheelchair, like, do you believe in Mary? And do you believe in the Virgin Mary? And we end up having, of course, the kid going like, well, yes, like I believe. And so we end up having Alice telling him like, well, okay, well, since you're in a wheelchair, now you can walk. And so we end up having this kid all of a sudden who just starts to get up and just start to walk, and everybody's like, oh my god, like this is crazy. And so we end up finding out that Alice is seemingly a healer, and it seems that people are starting to more and more believe in what Alice is doing. And so they are starting to believe that it seems that Alice is some kind of vessel for the Virgin Mary. So we go on, and so we end up having Jerry, who ends up doing interviews with Alice, kind of asking Alice, like, what does the Virgin Mary tell you? And we also have it to where Jerry is asking Alice, like, well, hey, like, what music have you been really listening to since you have the ability to? And we end up having her mention that she loves country. And Jerry's like, ugh, like, you know what? You could do a little bit more of discovering and figuring things out. So we go on and we have the Father Hagen, who is to interrupt Alice's and Jerry's interview to have the father mention that he kind of wants to really pull back a lot of stuff that's going on, because really he has seen other cases where we eventually have people who end up be calling these like prophets or these miracle people or whatever, and they end up getting like sent to the hospital forever or locked away or whatever, uh and they get like treated horribly, or they get like poked and prodded for probably the rest of their lives. So we eventually find out that it seems that Father Hagen, while he's talking to Jerry, it seems that he ends up having emphysema. He ends up having a lot of issues like coughing, and to the point where he's like coughing his head off, and we end up having bizarrely, because there's like two bizarre things that end up happening here. One, we end up having Jeffrey's character, who ends up diagnosing this guy has emphysema, even though he wouldn't know any better. Like, it's just a cough. And we also in this movie have a doctor that bizarrely has a requirement on speaking Latin in school. Is speaking Latin for a medical doctor a requirement to speak Latin? Whatever, that is such a bizarrish thing. Like, really, that is like the most stupid thing. Like, you would think that here's what this doctor should have said. Like, hey, like, I've had to learn like 8 different languages because I'm the only doctor in town. So bizarrely, I ended up just finding out like Latin luckily was one of the languages, because it was like a severely dead language that I tried to learn, because there is a like a person that just speaks Latin for the most point in our place. They could have found somebody who speaks Latin. They could have went to a library and said, "Hey, you speak Latin? What is this?" But no, they had to conveniently come up with a doctor that knows Latin, bizarrely, and they have to forcibly say that it's a requirement to learn Latin in school. Whatever. That's so garbage. So, but anyways, so we end up having Jeffrey, who easily diagnoses a thing of emphysema, or Jerry, because it seems that he ended up saying that his grandmother had it. So really, I guess he just assesses that this is emphysema because he's never seen this father once, throw up a cigarette. Whatever. All right. So we end up all of a sudden having this father just take a cigarette anyways after his huge coughing fit, and we end up having Jerry, who's mentioning like, "Do you think that's the right thing to do right now? Like, do you think that's like the best thing for you to do is just light it up?" And father is just like, "Yeah, whatever. Like, you know, and I just want to smoke. Like, give me a break." So we push on, and so we end up having this girl who is seemingly having a lot of people that are to really champion this Alice girl, to just say like, yeah, like if anything, this girl was a girl like me that was some outcast or some kind of person that couldn't really connect well with somebody, and I felt likewise like the same to her. And so immediately, like, I'm like I want to be able to show my support for this girl and so on and so forth. And we have this girl like wearing shirts that say Alice on it and all kinds of things. So I guess bizarrely having some like random person that is to like have it be like she's like the long distance Alice appreciator, I guess. So moving on. So we end up having Alice, who is to coincidentally be at this church where uh, where she is to sing, and we end up having her father, like her father Hager, going and starting to have a coughing fit yet again, so badly that he is conking out, that he is like falling over, and we end up having Alice before the father is to, I guess, die or leave or go or whatever. We end up having Alice, who desperately asks her father Hagen if he believes in Mary and so on and so forth, and we end up having Father Haggard saying yes. And so we end up having Father Haggard, who is now having his emphysema completely and utterly gone. So we end up having Jerry, who ends up bizarrely having nightmares about some cloaked individual that is kind of chasing after him in his dreams, and Jerry doesn't know exactly what that is. We end up having also Jerry, who is to eventually go and watch the interview that Alice had given him, and he had realized that there is some problem with the camera at some point. There is some kind of shadow or some kind of glitch that happens in some part of the interview. We end up having Jerry realize that the glitch is actually Mary bizarrely showing up in camera, and then also we end up having Mary actually showing up closer and closer to the TV, to the laptop screen, to where we are, of course, ending up getting a jump scare. So we end up having Jerry, who is to go along to see the father's doctor, because because Jerry wants to cover everything. So we end up having this doctor, who is Natalie Gates, I believe, and Natalie is to mention that through these x-rays, Father Hannigan was a goner. He was going to die. And here was the brand new x-rays that she just did of him, and the whole emphysema thing is now gone. He's perfectly healthy. So we end up having really Jerry, who is pushing to both this bishop and Delagarde that, like, see, like, you guys gave us the perfect definition of what a miracle is, and this is nailing it. Something that was to not be cured is now cured. So, hey guys, like, you need to basically say that this is going to be a shrine or a religious sanctioned thing, and that, like, you need to, like, basically say that, like, Alice is this prophet or whatever. And so we end up having Jerry, who is pushing this story and pushing it hard. And so we end up having Jerry, who ends up calling this girl named Monica to try to get a better rung of career to push this story to someone. And Monica is like, dude, like, you ruffled a lot of feathers like before all this, and so I have no interest in booking you a story. Like, I have no interest in having you work with us whatsoever. And so we have it to where Jerry just kind of feels defeated that he's just going to have to just send this story to wherever is just going to be probably the smallest outlet. But eventually we end up having Monica who ends up calling Jerry, and Jerry's like, oh, no, 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 no. Like, if you want this story because you realize how good it is, I am going to get all kinds of exclusives. I'm going to uh, have this story only be done by me. I want uh, I want an office with a window in it and all kinds of perks and all kinds of I want an office in the corner with window and perks and all kinds of things. To where Jerry is just trying to really push that okay, Monica, you said no before. Well, you're saying yes now. Why? And so now I'm going to push how far I can get a yes out of you because you need this story. So we have it to where eventually we have Father Haggard that is by himself in the church. So we end up having the father who is to see someone go into the confessional. And so we end up having Father Haggard that goes in there going confession time is only during this, during peak hours or whatever. And so we end up having this confessor confess anyways. So we end up having Father Haggard hearing this person's confession, even though really he's just like, God, like I'm so done for today. I don't give a whatever. And so we end up having this confessor who is to mention that they have done quite a bit of wrongdoings and that they have killed people, and eventually they will kill again and they will kill Father Hagen. And we end up having Father Hagen, who I guess is just so oblivious of what this girl even said because he didn't care about it. We end up having it to where Father Hagen says, well, just say 3 Hail Marys and what? So we end up finding out that the Virgin Mary is going and trying to get to Father Haggard, to where we end up having Father Haggard who ends up trying to run from this confessional, hearing that he is going to quite possibly die. And so we end up having Father Haggard that is trying to run out of this church, and we end up having the Virgin Mary appear as this very creepy cloaked individual with this with this mask of sorts and all kind of villainish looking thing. And so we end up having eventually where the Virgin Mary goes and hangs Father Hagen and kills him. So we end up having eventually Jerry, who is to go into the church to try and talk with the father again, and he ends up finding him hung there. So he ends up calling everybody and going and trying to get this priest down. So we end up having eventually Jerry going to the bishop, and the bishop is like, well, we have Jerry who is assuming dude, why is it that this guy who had just been cured of his emphysema, why would he take his own life? This makes no sense. Somebody had to have done him in, as if Jerry is trying to do this investigation and try to come up to the bottom of this. And we end up having the bishop who is just kind of ignoring that. He's just yeah, it does sound really unreasonable, but maybe the father just had other kind of demons, other kind of burdens, and we don't know, kind of thing. And so really we just frown upon anybody who ends up taking his own life. And so we eventually have it to where eventually we end up having Jerry who goes and tries to investigate this tree location, and because we end up also having the father who ends up going and going into the tent where this tree was, and he ends up finding the doll. It seems that eventually Jerry ends up going and trying to research this tree and research this doll and try to figure out if there's a connection somewhere, where eventually he actually does. We end up finding out that it seems like there was some girl who was named Mary, and she had gotten to be like Salem witch trial, like burned to the stake, because she had sold her soul to the devil, and she had been doing all kinds of uh, gifts uh, and spiritual healing and all kinds of stuff, to where eventually, like, it did cost people at the end of all of this, but uh, really we find out that after Mary was killed off, it seems that all the gifts that she had given to everyone eventually all went away. So we end up eventually having us find out about this much more. We end up having it to where it seems that that Father Hagen had, I guess, had some research material already out about this whole situation. It seemed that Father Hagen was researching the doll of which that could have been possessed by someone in this tree and all kinds of information. After Jerry had went to the library and checked this out, it seemed like the father was looking into this as well. So, hence why the father needed to die, because if he was going to be the like, if anything, the father was probably going to be the best whistleblower out of all this. So we end up finding out that it seems that Jerry realizes that this this Mary, who is not actually Virgin Mary, uh, she is some kind of monster or demon, of course, that had sold her soul to the devil to give gifts to people, and is still a spirit that is roaming around because she is now out of this doll. We end up having Jerry realize that Mary is manipulating Alice to get Mary followers so Mary can become stronger. And so we end up having Alice, uh, who is to tell Delgardi that they need to go and put on a service at the tent. They need to do some kind of service of sorts to worship Mary, because we have it to where Mary is whispering sweet nothings to Alice that she needs more followers, that she needs to grow stronger. And so we end up having Alice, who is telling Delgard that they need to go and try and pray in this situation, in this tent location. So we end up having them go on to eventually go and put on this huge ordeal where the bishop's there, Delgard is there. They're all like preaching and doing sermons with Alice, and going on and on about this whole Mary thing, to where they are trying to worship Mary and so on and so forth. Because we end up having Jerry, who is to try to pull a plug on this whole thing. We end up having, before this whole situation goes on, we end up having both. We end up having Jerry going to the bishop and Delgard to try to pull the plug on this, to basically say, hey, like, if anything, what we're thinking that this is going on maybe isn't actually correct. And we end up having Bishop and Delgado like, wait a minute, like, out of all the people that are trying, like, that should have been not be pulling the plug on this, you should be number one on that list. Like, if anything, like, this is your story, that, like, this is your thing. Like, why is it that why you're not pushing this story anymore? Why you're trying to turn off the light switch of this story? Why? And so we end up having Jerry, who realizes that, one, he was the one that had unlocked this spirit from this doll. He had made this mistake. He had opened up this gate for this dog to come out, kind of thing. So we end up having Jerry, who is trying to correct the mistake that he had made. And we end up having this bishop and this priest just telling him, it's like, no, like, we're going to go along with this because, like, if anything, I think you've just, like, stood too close to the sun there, Jerry. I think really you've just, like, I think you're seeing something in this that isn't actually true. So we go on and we end up having the bishop and the priest, and uh they're doing this thing, this they're doing the preaching and whatever. And so we end up eventually this doctor uh and both Jerry uh go into the church to try to do some kind of ritual to stop Mary from, like, they are trying to figure out some way to stop Mary. And we end up having Mary, who ends up going on to burn a cross. And so we end up having the priest who ends up trying to come in and speak in scripture. The Delgard priest, we end up having him trying to stop Mary, and we end up having the cross ending up falling onto this priest and ended up killing him off. So we end up having Jerry and the doctor, who are scrambling to go to uh, this get together to tell Alice that Mary is actually hurting people. She is not helping people. And Alice is just in disagreement. It's like, no, like, if anything, like, Mary is telling me that she's helping people. It's like, and like, this doctor and Alice are desperately, or this doctor and Jerry are desperately trying to tell Alice, no, you don't understand what's going on. This isn't the Virgin Mary. It's just some woman named Mary that, like, and so they're trying to tell her this. They're trying to help her understand. And so we end up having both Jerry and Natalie, who are desperately trying to make people not believe. They're desperately telling people, like, hey, stop believing in Mary. It's all a hoax. We end up having Jerry get up and, like, trying to tell people all this was a hoax. All of it was a lie. All of this was fabrication and everything like that. And Alice is just kind of baffled why these people are trying so hard to stop all this, that we end up even having Alice, who is like, well, you know what? Like, I think I'm going to go along with Jerry and Natalie. Like, it seems like they are good people, and there has to be a reason why they are trying to do this. So I'm going to go along with this and say that, yeah, like, I lied about everything. Don't believe in Mary. Like, I have been whispering sweet nothings, and maybe, like, I have been following the wrong deity, or I've been following the wrong thing. I've lost my way. So we end up having, eventually, Alice is trying to tell everybody to stop believing in Mary. So here is the thing. The reason why Alice had made it back to that tree is because Alice was the last descendant of Mary. It seems that Alice, before she was taken and before she was to be burnt to the stake or whatever, she ended up having a child before that. And I guess Alice was coincidentally the very last descendant of Alice's bloodline. So that is the reason why Alice was chosen to be this vessel for Mary, to force Alice to get the word out for her. So we end up having, eventually, that it seems that people are starting to disbelieve in Mary, and so all of a sudden we eventually have it to where there is a fire that eventually breaks out in this tent because of Mary. Like, flames start to appear in this camp. We start having people scrambling out of here. We eventually have it to where Mary ends up arriving to have the bishop go and try to put his cross on her, and we end up having instantly Mary just burning this bishop alive. So we end up having both Jerry and Alice now trying to talk to Mary to get her to go away, to get her to stop. And so we end up having it to where Jerry is trying to fight Mary, but, like, he's getting his, like, arms, like, mangled, and he's getting really burnt. And plus, it was also kind of interesting to have Jerry stop trying to do this story when Monica comes a calling. And we end up having Jerry who mentions that he probably did sell his soul to get a story out of this. It's kind of really interesting. So we have Jerry who is to try to stop Mary, and eventually we end up having Alice jumping in the way of protecting Jerry, and we end up having Mary who ends up burning Alice to basically just kill her off by accident. And so we end up having Mary who now no longer has a last descendant to carry her word. We end up having Mary who is now just burning up and vanishing. To where we have Jerry who is holding Alice, and for the first time in his life, he ends up going and seemingly talking to God and mentioning, like, hey, like, this girl is so young, and hey, this isn't her time. Like, she died protecting me, so let her live. And so we end up having Alice, who ends up, of course, bizarrely waking up, and now she does no longer have her gifts of hearing or speaking. And so we end up having Alice, who is now doing sign language to basically showcase to us that it's like, okay, well, she's back to her normal self as well as everyone else is. And so we eventually have it to where Jerry is talking to Alice and trying to do some kind of sign language to try to say that like he's trying to learn, because it seems that like he wanted to like still be friends with Alice, with her being able to just have to know sign language, because it was kind of interesting how like Natalie was still doing sign language and Alice was like pushing her hands down to just like, dude, I can hear you, I can see you, like I can hear you talking, like you don't have to do sign language anymore. But eventually towards the end of the movie, we end up having both Natalie and Jerry doing sign language, and so that way Alice could talk to them. So yeah, we end up having it to where all of this eventually ends up just getting resolved, and so yeah, we really just end up having it to where this movie just all ends on a happy note, where we end up having Jerry who's like, yeah, it was kind of weird that all of a sudden Alice had come back to life, and Natalie was like, well, maybe God was actually like there helping you guys through this process. Maybe there was some kind of divine thing going on here to do the right thing. So yeah, I think that is about the end of the movie. I think I kind of covered everything, but I also want to get out of here. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.